Welcome to the Safety and Risk Success podcast with me, Christian Harris. My guest today is Heather Beach, and we do a deep dive into the world of mental health, which, as Heather will share with some of the statistics, is a massive, massive problem that affects us all. And what we do is we talk about why that problem exists, what's been happening with it, and importantly, what we can do in terms of strategies as business managers and leaders to do something about it. This is a safety roundtable session, so the discussion with myself and Heather is then followed up by some interactive questions from the audience, all of which bring something new and interesting to the conversation. So I'm sure you will get a lot from this. I'd encourage you to pick up a copy of Heather's book, follow and connect with her on LinkedIn, and keep up this really important conversation. And I hope you enjoy the episode. Cheers.
Welcome to the Safety and Risk Success podcast with Christian Harris. We believe that proactive safety and risk management powers business performance. Each week we explore this theme, sharing guests, stories, insights, trends, hints and tips. You can find us on all the major podcasting platforms, and video versions are available on YouTube. But for now, let's join the conversation with Christian.
Really pleased to be joined by Heather Beach, and we're going to be talking about mental health, which is a topic that is massive and a topic that affects lots of us, and one that is certainly worthy of discussion. Heather, just to start with, thank you for joining. Would you like to just do a quick intro?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Heather Beach, and I've been working in the health and safety community for the last 30 years. I ran SHP Magazine, IOSH Conference, Safety and Health Expo, and Barber, which none of you look old enough to remember Barber, but it was a microfiche product originally, which had all the full text of HSE information on it. And then 7 years ago, I decided that I really wanted to do something that I was really passionate about and that I could continue to learn whilst I was on the job. So I started a master's in applied positive psychology, remortgaged my house, ran a conference with Alistair Campbell speaking at it, and started a healthy work company. And I've been fortunate to work with organisations like all sorts of organisations, Luton Airport, Telegraph, ITV, increasingly global, CBRE, Seadrill, people like that. So I've worked with about 150 different brands over the last 7 years, and we're all learning. This is not like an area which anybody has absolutely cracked. So I'm probably a little bit ahead of people because I work with some amazing clients and I'm constantly studying this area, but there is no blueprint at the moment. So we're all trying to develop that blueprint between us. I also run Women in Health and Safety, by the way, which I started as part of my role at Informa UBM, and they asked me to continue with it because they didn't have anyone else to take it over. So I'm running that as well.
Good stuff. Thank you very much. So let's start with a bit of your sort of driver for where you're at, which you gave us the kind of businessy stuff, but one of the things you've spoken about before is the challenges, I suppose, of balancing being a single mum and a professional. So how do you kind of manage your time and prioritize between these two very significant things you need to do? And how has that kind of personal experience driven your focus on well-being? Because I'm sure that the two must be aligned in some way.
It's such an interesting question, Christian, because I regard myself as almost a living experiment for all of these areas. I'm trying constantly to look at what works best for me, because I think, being a single mum, being a single parent of any kind, and 25% of us are single parents right now, with 90% of those being single mums, is really hard work. And I had really underestimated how hard it would be. Alongside, I also underestimated how hard running your own business would be. Yeah. So I am constantly experimenting with best use of my time, yes, but also trying to understand my own drivers better, which is something which I think we all as human beings need to get better at. We don't necessarily think of understand how important it is until we bump into an aspect of ourselves that just doesn't really work. So we might have a little burnout, or we might get, we might find that we're really struggling in some way. And those are all signs that actually there's something going on, which means that we potentially could look at and actually maybe address. So perfectionism is one that I recently discovered a few years ago that I struggle with, and I had no idea I was a perfectionist. But discovering that does give me a little bit of choice about it. So I now understand that when I react badly, when I make a mistake, that actually that's me. It's not necessarily anything out there in reality, and I can then make a bit of a choice about it. But in answer to your question, I don't have a blueprint. I'm constantly experimenting and looking at what works, what doesn't work, and it changes. Work-life balance is a constant work in progress for all of us. It's not something that I have down pat, for sure.
No, and I imagine what we would have been saying if we'd spoken about this in October of 2019 versus if we were talking about this challenge in October of 2020. Obviously things can massively change, can't they?
Yeah.
And by the way, everybody, any questions for Heather? This is going to be an interactive session, so Heather and I are going to chat for a little bit, and then we're going to open it up to questions. So any questions that are coming through, I'll be monitoring on the chat. But if you're on the Zoom, then at the appropriate time, I'll ask you to raise your hand, and you can unmute and kind of join in the chat live. So do start thinking about any questions. So we all kind of know that mental health is a big thing, but there are different ways of defining it. So I'm interested to think about kind of some sort of definition. It's quite hard to define what mental health is, because I guess there are loads of different ways that people can present with issues. But in terms of the size and the scope of the issue in the UK, have you got any ways that we can sort of try to size that up? And then kind of how's that been changing over time?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very, very difficult to actually look at what the size of the issue is, because if we think about it, when we first started looking at this whole area, a lot of what we were looking at was destigmatizing mental illness. So when we think about mental illnesses, we might be thinking about something as wide ranging as taking us from schizophrenia and bipolar disorder through to, depression and anxiety. And we all know also that there is no blood test that tells you whether you've got anxiety. It's basically subjective, and it's based on a triage system, which the GP helps you out with. So we know that a lot of us are struggling. So during the pandemic, particularly, there was stats that came out from the World Health Organization that said that there was an increase of 25% in the diagnosis of anxiety or depression. But what we have a more difficulty measuring is actual, when we're struggling. And then there's also the fact that much of that struggling is actually just life struggles, which all of us have had over the years, and we all know a part of being a human being. We are not going to go through life without struggling to a certain extent, and that does not mean that we are ill. My mum died a couple of years ago, and then we really struggled with my dad's care. My dad died a year later. During that year, my daughter also got diagnosed with severe obsessive compulsive disorder. I was a single mum trying to run a business. Do you think I was struggling? Absolutely, I was struggling. But was I mentally ill? I don't think so. I think I was just, dealing with life's problems. And so I don't think a pill would have been the right thing to actually prescribe me at that time. But now let's have a look at one stat that we do know. So we know that a large percentage of the UK is currently taking what we call an SSRI, so an antidepressant, anti-anxiety pill. So we know that 8% of the UK population is currently taking an SSRI. Now, I want to be really clear here. There is nothing wrong with SSRIs. And actually, many people, they're the difference between life and death for them. My daughter's on quite a high dose because of her OCD. Other members of my family have also taken them as well. But that does mean that we are going to the GP and we are being diagnosed in very large numbers with anxiety and or depression. forgetting schizophrenia, it's forgetting bipolar disorder. It's just the stuff which we are given tablets for, anti-anxiety, antidepressants for. So that's 8% of us. 1 in 8. I beg your pardon,
Yeah.
I've been getting
1
it
in
wrong.
8, yeah.
1 in 8. 12.8% of the population, 1 in 8 of us, is apparently suffering from an anxiety disorder right now. So that's one way of measuring it. And why is that? Well, we go to the GP, and we know that GPs are stretched. We know that the tertiary services sitting behind the GP are stretched. It may be that actually what would benefit you most would be some talking therapy. But are there talking therapists available? Maybe not. So is it easier just to give you a tablet and send you away? Possibly.
Cheaper for sure. I'm sure, because
Yeah.
the cost of the tablet versus the cost of putting lots of people through talking therapy must pale into insignificance.
Yeah, it must do. And so we've kind of, and what's really a bit scary about these is the withdrawal from them can be very lengthy, and we don't know enough about it. So my daughter's still on 200 milligrams, which is a very high dose, and the GP's never said, look, we need to review this. And I'm going to have to proactively go back to a psychiatrist and say, look, can we start to taper? And tapering looks like very, very marginal decreases every day, because we don't really know what it does. We know it's really difficult to come off them, but we know that it's really it has to be done really slowly. So one of my concerns is that we're over prescribing these, and we're over prescribing them when people actually just need some talking. They need to actually or work out what their problems are, because they can be manifold, can't they? It can be to do with finances, it can be to do with relationships, it can be to do with work, it can be to do with all these different things. But rather than taking a pill, we really need to work that out and try and get rid of what the underlying causes are. And I want to be clear again, because I do get picked up on this sometimes. They are the right thing for many people. It's just that I think that we're probably using them as an issue, to try and cure life's ills.
Yeah, and I guess one of the big drivers is that there's more awareness, isn't there, about mental health than there was, and there's a more willingness to sort of talk about it. So we're probably seeing that, people are going to their GP and presenting with an issue when perhaps they wouldn't have done before, and that's having that pressure increasing, as you say, on the GPs that are already stretched. And so it's self-perpetuating a little bit, isn't it?
It's very, very difficult to tell, and there is some research that shows that there is an increase, partially because we're more aware and we're talking about it more, but there is also an awful lot more research that shows that we are just struggling right now. For many reasons, we're struggling because of the way our society is set up, because of the way our brains work, and it's not consistent with healthy living. So the way our brains work is not consistent with the way we live our lives today. So that is one of the fundamental problems. And then we've got technology. So I recently read some studies which were really interesting, which talked about suicide, and it was said that overall in the Western world, so in the Anglophone countries and in the Nordic countries, overall suicide hasn't increased, but the percentage in that of teenage girls that are particularly attempting suicide or taking their own lives has gone up significantly. All around the developed world, and a lot of that, the only thing that's consistent, like that actually sits inside of the right timing for that, is the advent of smartphones and social media. And if teenage girls are subject to this, we as adults are subject to it as well. Because we're all struggling with being on call 24/7, having everything being an emergency, our brains getting thrown into that emergency state the whole time, and then we're going to struggle overall with chronic stress. So it's really difficult to be able to actually work out. Yes, we're talking about it more. That's good. And is that leading to an uptick in diagnosis? Some research says yes, but we've got endemic issues which are basically causing this problem. So there's no point in saying, oh, it's all about overdiagnosis. It's actually all about the way we live our lives today, the way our society functions, which isn't consistent with good mental health.
Yeah. And you mentioned when we had a sort of pre-chat a bit about this kind of the kind of evolutionary drivers, I suppose, is I think the term that you used. So
yeah,
feeling like we're sometimes on autopilot, and I certainly have that sense, quite often, partly because I'm trying to systemize as much as I can, but so you kind of feel like you're just going through and doing what you need to do. But obviously that's perhaps not the best way of acting. Why is that a problem? And do you want to talk a little bit about some of those causes and how we can get stuck in this sort of situation?
Yeah, so there's the way that our brains work, there's two things in there that I want to highlight. So the first one is our stress response system. So our stress response system was built for our survival. It was built in order for us to get away from or hide from that saber-toothed tiger. And in reality now, our stress response system gets triggered all the time by things which are nothing to do with our day-to-day survival. They're more to do with our ego, to do with our uncertainty in the future, a worry that we have, which will cause our stress response system to, start that whole process of our heart racing, our palms getting sweaty, and we can get into a point where we're in that way more than we should be. And that can then lead us to chronic health issues, not only mental health, but also physical health issues. We know that, this is bodily inflammation, stress, they basically work in tandem to cause a lot of these issues. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is that our brain conserves energy by developing habits. And we develop habits, we end up on this hamster wheel of activity. So that actually, I don't know if anybody here can relate to this, but when you stop, you're like, well, now what do I do? And actually it can be, you think, right, I need to get on with some work again, because at least I know where I am when I'm working. So, we end up with these shortcuts in our brain to conserve energy. This is just the way we live our lives. So we get an email in, we swap to whatever we're doing onto that email, and we answer that email because it's urgent. We basically, we work until we've finished, in quotes. We're never going to finish, but we get into these habits, which is just the way that we live and work and respond or react rather to every situation. And that then, and those habits are in the main counterproductive. So when my dad was at work, a huge distinction between the way that we work today and the way my dad worked. So when my dad finished work, at the end of the day, he put his case down, and he basically didn't do any work for the rest of the evening, didn't do any work over the holidays, didn't do any work at the weekends. That was never going to happen, just didn't happen. 9 to 5 was what he did. We don't work like that anymore. And everything's so fast. So again, he would have had a secretary that would have typed everything up, would have gone in a brown internal envelope on a trolley, and then eventually someone would have answered it, and eventually we would have reached a decision, a consensus decision. Now we're working incredibly fast and everything is urgent. Everything has to be done today. So that's already a huge shift in the way that we work. A lot of that underpinned by and driven by technology, as we know. That plays into our stress response system. It plays into the way that we actually just function as a human being.
Yeah, it's amazing to think, isn't it, how things have shifted so much in the world, but yet the makeup of our brains and our bodies, obviously has evolved over time, but much slower. And so, yeah, we've got this system inside ourselves that was built for a different time and age, and how do we sort of figure it out to make it better for now? It's very, very interesting thing to think about. So we're joined with a audience of safety and risk professionals, so let's move on a little bit to kind of, with that context then of the size of the problem and some of the drivers, what can we do about it? And this episode is called Thriving, Not Surviving. So from a business perspective, firstly, you put your book out recently called I'm a Boss, Not a Shrink, which I thought was a really interesting title. So I'm interested to know where that title came from, and kind of what inspired you to do that in terms of writing the book and focusing on that side of this.
Well, to be honest, I've always felt ever since I started the business that really we should be starting with managers when we do this training. So your manager should be your first port of call when you're struggling. Your manager should be the first person that notices when you're struggling, or your supervisor. And I was slightly mortified by the huge amount of mental health first aid that was going around, and people were giving that to managers, for example, and that isn't an appropriate course for managers. Managers have got legal duties that aren't covered in that course. So I'm not saying it's a bad course, by the way, and I think it's done a lot of good, but I don't think it should have been the first focus. The first focus should have been on training managers, and if you haven't trained managers yet, that should be where you're looking. I can't remember the question, Christian. I've lost the plot. What was it then?
It was kind of what inspired you to look at
Yes,
this side of things, and then where did the name come from as well?
Okay, and I've also been a manager myself. I've been a manager of large teams, small teams, and actually I have really struggled with that. I've struggled with that conversation myself. So I had HR teams helping me out, and I got a lot better as I got older, and I got more comfortable with it. But it was at first, as a young manager, aged 23, managing people that were older than me, I had no idea. And that actually has become a much more important conversation today than it was when I was a young manager, 30 years ago. There's tons more of this sort of conversation that needs to be happening. So I think that fundamentally we should be training our managers, and that's why I wrote the book. And I called it "I'm a Boss, Not a Shrink," because I think it's a balance. It's such a difficult balance for managers to get right. Though, we've trained lots of people, and we've struggled to kind of get the message across that you can be a really empathetic manager and really listen really well. And at the same time, you do need to manage performance. So there's a balance. You're managing the needs of the person and the needs of the business. And that's a really, really tricky thing for managers to get right. We find that some are actually so good at that empathetic conversation, they have people going back to them again and again and again, and they almost become like their life coach. And actually that's not appropriate either. So it's that sort of consideration that we've got.
Yeah, you can see how if you've got that good empathy, and people feel comfortable with you because they're used to working with you, that they could sort of rely on you as a bit of a crutch. But that equally could be dangerous in many respects, because you do need to maintain that kind of business relationship, don't you?
It's definitely, you need to maintain that business relationship, but it's also, are you the best person to be having that conversation? Or actually, would they be better talking to someone who has got the professional expertise to support them?
Yeah, and it's interesting to think about that in the context of what we were speaking about earlier around the GPs as well being stretched, because I often use the analogy of say a safety leader being a bit like a GP, because you are presented with different problems from different people coming at you from all directions throughout the day, and you don't know what those problems are going to be until that person turns up. And therefore you've got to have such a broad amount of knowledge. But if you've got knowledge that's a mile wide, if you think of rolling some dough into a pizza, making that pizza shape and making it nice and big means that it's quite flat and shallow. And so there is that risk that, if you could maybe end up trying with the best intentions to help somebody in this area. And there's a whole other question around, should safety people be dealing with this area as well as physical health and safety too, but perhaps, as you say, you're not the right person to do that because you don't have the depth of knowledge.
I mean, I fundamentally believe that health and safety professionals should absolutely be involved in this area. It doesn't mean they need to do it all. It doesn't mean they need to be coordinating the plan. But if you look at a Reiki matrix and look at where health and safety fits in, it certainly should be looking at organizational stress risk assessment as a minimum. It should be looking at how well-being and safety fit together. So, am I safe if I'm unwell mentally? No, you're not, are you? We all know you're frustrated, you've got stress, you've got anxiety, you're depressed, you're fatigued, you've got other kinds of impairment, you're not going to be safe. So health and safety managers need to consider that in their, are they, for example, collecting that data when they look at accidents and incidents? I think too few accident and incident investigations look at well-being as or you know, some of those human factors, but well-being inside of that. You know, was I absolutely tired out when I started my shift today? And then learning lessons from that, and making the environment psychologically safe in which those kinds of topics can be raised, which is not an easy thing. And then the other thing is, quite often people are more comfortable in going to their health and safety person than they are to their HR person. We find that a lot of health and safety people are often first port of call in this. People want to speak to them, because now that we've got a change in the profession towards more empathy, engagement, you know, influencing skills, that they've always been good people, but they are now people as well. So there's a real benefit to them being involved in this area, but they don't have to do it all. They need to work with their HR team to get it done.
No, fully agree with that. And there's definitely a lot of research around tiredness, isn't there, contributing to to incidents. So, you know, what can we do to? My approach is always to be evangelizing prevention. So, you know, what can we do around well-being to stop people being so tired? And that's going to have a knock-on effect on our incidents. You know, that's got to be something that we should certainly be looking at. And how about from a sort of more senior level then, from a kind of board or an MD kind of level, what should those sorts of people be bearing in mind when it comes to this topic?
Well, again, so I'm really impatient. It's part of my, the underpinning stuff that works for me and really doesn't work for me as well, is that I'm really impatient. And I would have hoped that by now boards would be absolutely enmeshed in this conversation. And I did some research a couple of years ago that showed that 92% of people that we asked had a wellbeing strategy, and only 29% of those had the board actually been trained or been involved in that strategy. So it's not a strategy if your board isn't involved in it, fundamentally, because there's when we look at work, we need to be thinking about a few areas. We need to be thinking about those tertiary interventions. When it all goes wrong, what do I do? Have I got an employee assistance program? Am I offering an online GP, which is really, really great thing to have these days as an organization? Have I got mental health first aid? What do I do when it all goes wrong? We've got that. And a lot of organizations do that quite well now, because they've been doing it for a long time. And then there's also the sort of the promotion side, the education side, the thinking about, are we educating people in looking after themselves? Are we educating managers in how to have these conversations? Are we actually doing that education according to the demographic, according to the stakeholder? Is it different according to who we're delivering it to? You know, in lots of organizations now, we're doing menopause training, we're doing some of the more sort of men's health in organizations with lots of men in, for example. So trying to make sure it's appropriate to the demographic. But the research shows that the latest Deloitte research shows that the main place we're going to actually get real impact is when we focus on primary interventions. So primary interventions are those things which look at what causes stress in our workplace. We all know that the HSE actually does require an organisational stress risk assessment at least annually, or any big change in the business. Do most people do it? No. And even if they do it, they don't really do it in a meaningful way. It's more of a tick box exercise. But fundamentally, unless our senior team is engaged and looking at work design, so how does work actually take place in this organisation? What causes stress in this organisation? How do we do business, which actually means that people are happy, thriving, or not happy, thriving, stressed, overworked, overwhelmed, whatever those things might be? Unless the senior team are involved in that, you haven't got any hope of improving your primary interventions, you're reducing stress in your organisation. Furthermore, your senior team and their role modelling is all important. If I've done organisations, I've trained all their middle managers. Brilliant. They've loved it. They've really tried to change their behaviour. And then they get from their senior manager an email at 11 o'clock at night, and they're expected to respond straight away. And it's really not that urgent. But that is the role modelling that senior leader is giving, which then goes down through the organisation, and then that's the behaviour, and then the behaviour doesn't change. So fundamentally, there are two roles for your senior leaders. There's looking at their own role modelling, and there's looking at work design. And then, of course, there's investing in the right areas as well. And that's another aspect, which I think is we're looking at, we're experimenting with as much as anything at the moment.
Yeah, that third bit is key, isn't it? Because I think that's how you can get the buy-in from them. If you could, prove as much as possible that investing in this area is going to drive performance of the business, then
I think, Christian, we haven't even asked the right questions, because we're not even looking at what the business drivers are for this. When we're bringing in a mental health and wellbeing program, we're not aware of what problem are we trying to solve or what opportunity are we trying to exploit. Because, unless we are clear with what the business drivers are, then the board isn't going to buy in the first place. So, for example, you might be struggling to recruit. So maybe you need to create a world-class environment where people really want to come and work for you. You might be struggling with having a huge amount of sickness absence. And if you drill down, a lot of that might be due to stress or mental health issues. So can you resolve that? And will that make a big difference to the bottom line if you do so? You might be struggling with, people, for example, not being agile in their working, or it's thinking about what are your business drivers, and then getting the board involved from the point of view of their particular axe to grind. So, where do I come from as a board member? What's really important to me, and how then can I influence you to buy in based on what you need.
Yeah, I mean, I love that, actually, that we need to be taking a step back and looking at actually what are we trying to prevent or trying to achieve here. And I think sometimes we act in safety, health, well-being from the perspective of it's the right thing to do, but we don't necessarily link well enough, as you've identified, the business drivers. And that's when things can, although we've got the right intentions, we don't necessarily get to the right outcomes.
And that's how can we measure? Like, people are always asking me at the moment, well, what measurements can we use? So I always turn it back and say, well, what were you trying to achieve? Because if you know what you're trying to achieve, then you know what you're going to measure. So I'm working with an organisation at the moment, and part of their stress risk assessment, part of their wellbeing strategy was around access to support without stigma, because they had loads of support available, but just no one was using it. And so one of the measures we're using is how many more people are accessing that support. It's as simple as that, because that was one of the things they wanted to address. So unless you're clear on what you want to address, then you can't actually look at what you're measuring.
And that's a good example of an input as well, isn't it, rather than an output as such? Because that's accessing that support is going to drive some of the outcomes at the end, but it's not actually the outcome. It's what's going in towards the top of the process.
Yeah, exactly. And we had measures for all three areas, so primary, secondary, and tertiary, and they know what they're measuring inside of that because they know what they were trying to achieve. Yeah,
no, that all makes sense. I'm going to start opening this up to questions soon. So if you've got a question or a comment or an insight or some experiences that you'd love to come and share with Heather, and I'll stick my oar in where appropriate as well. If you're on the Zoom, just go to reactions, raise your hand, and I'll call you up to unmute in a minute. And I'll start. I've been watching some of the comments coming in on LinkedIn and so on as well. So I'll pick up some questions from there as well. So Heather, we called this session Thrive Not Survive. So how would you sort of define or summarize that state of thriving rather than surviving?
So if we think about the mental health continuum, which I always think is fundamental to talking about mental health, as human beings, we might be in that quadrant called flourishing or thriving some of the time. And that suggests that we are not only happy, but we've also got growth associated with it, with what's going on. So happiness is a very difficult topic to actually even start to describe. But when we think about it, it's, am I happy in the moment? Have I got hedonic happiness? Am I, having a nice glass of kombucha in this case? Am I chatting to my friends? Am I having a nice time? And then on the other side of the coin, there's long-term meaning and life satisfaction, which can come through pain. So we want to be looking at both of those, and that's where flourishing, thriving sits. We've all been in that position, hopefully, at some point in our lives. We're really enjoying what we do, and we feel what we do has meaning. And then a lot of the time we're in moderate mental health, so we maybe don't have an aspect of that. It's not really particularly working out for us. And then we end up struggling. And then struggling, we are really starting to feel that we're not right. So we might be sleeping badly, we might be not eating the right foods, we might be having a lot of rows. I personally get very triggered, and I always take it out on my 17-year-old when I get angry. Don't take it out on my clients, I take it out on poor her. But you know, that we'll be doing something that will show we're struggling. And then if we keep going around that, we're mentally ill, etc., etc. So, you know, but our aim as human beings, we know some of our life we're going to be struggling. We're not human if we're not struggling, but is to try to keep moving ourselves back up towards flourishing. What do I need to do for me right now to improve my flourishing quotient, as it were? And that will be different from human being to human being. The recipe for perfect happiness can't be copied from individual to individual, says Csikszentmihalyi. So, and I love that quote, because if you tell me I've got to run, I'll tell you I'm only running for a bag of chips. You know, so we're all different, and trying to find out what makes us tick, what we enjoy, what brings us meaning and purpose is fundamental within that. And then making sure that we schedule that stuff in and we're doing it, not just knowing it, but we're actually doing it.
Good stuff. That's I mean, I'm with you. I'm not much of a runner. I like to go for a game of snooker. That sort of relaxes me and kind of gets my brain in a nice positive space. Let's start taking some questions. Matthew, you were first with your hand up. Do you want to unmute and come on board?
Hi, fascinating subject. Thanks, Eva, for doing the talk around this. I'm studying for an MSc in occupational health and wellbeing, so this is kind of bang on trend for me at the moment. I'm interested in the whole concept of mental health and wellbeing. Obviously, to me, wellbeing is much broader than mental health, and for some reason, employers are being expected to take on everybody's mental health when there's not. There needs to be some element of independence there for the employee. But a couple of things you picked up on, you were talking about the hedonic happiness, or the happiness in the now, and then thinking about flourishing, and the term flourishing coming from eudaimonic well-being. And Aristotle's. There is some literature, especially when we look at, I guess, Wilson and others, that talk about not being able to get to the flourishing state because you don't have self-actualization or self-determination. There's something to think about, that not everybody will be in a position to be able to flourish, but your version of what you're talking about is flourishing in the now, which is quite interesting. I've not come across that. And also a nod to the post-traumatic growth. Humans are set up primarily to learn from their mistakes. Just the way we are, we're pessimistic people. Even if we're trying to be happy all the time, our greatest learnings come from the darkest places that we've been to. So that's really interesting. My question to you, though, is how do you define well-being? And I guess, how do you see the difference between individual well-being and the collective well-being of the workplace? Because that's completely subjective, but also would work when we're designing well-being programs. We're thinking about individuals and not collective well-being.
Oh, I think that's, well, it's a great point. So well-being, I think, is a very difficult one. There are about 99 different definitions. And by the way, when I was talking about hedonic happiness in the now, flourishing, I think, is over a longer term. But anyway, just put that one to one side. So when it comes to workplace as opposed to individuals, I think that's why I believe that those primary interventions need to focus on work design and the way that work is done around here, and cultural things, and then there is an element of, so I've got a Venn diagram. I did a relational organizational gestalt course, which is all about the fact that well-being is a relational concept. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists in terms of where my relationships with my manager, my relationship with the organization, what I'm doing for myself. And as employers, I think we need to work in all three areas. We need to look at educating individuals to look after themselves as far as possible. We need to educate managers but we also need to look at how we do work, how work actually happens around here, what our culture's like, what do we have work charters between us, that sort of thing. And I think we need to give a great deal more thought to that than we have done in the past, because of the situation that we're currently in and the way work is currently being done in the UK. We need to really proactively take hold of that as organisations and look at how we design it better.
Good stuff. Thanks for the question, Matthew, and thanks, Heather, for the reply. There's a question here in the chat from Suki, which is, I'd be really interested to understand how we as professionals have demonstrated return on investment of wellbeing programs to leadership that are perhaps a little skeptical. Any case studies or examples of that?
I am constantly seeking Susan when it comes to that. I do have some examples of people who have made a measurable difference in this area. And if you look at the something like the Mind awards, you'll see that BAM are constantly winning. And I'm speaking to her next week about what she's actually doing, which is working. Because for me, what we've done in this area is we've started out with a load of interventions, generally mental health first aid, generally the employee assistance program. They're not making a difference. We've got no measure, but we can't measure them, or we don't know what difference they're making. Well, what were you trying to do with them? So that's what we've done. And now we're looking at, then during COVID, we looked at a whole load of interventions to make people feel better in the moment. And we might have done some research on what worked about those. We haven't really demonstrated any return on investment. Now we're finally coming out of that, and we're looking at, okay, how do we create a systemic difference? Right, something like 45,003 might help us. That's a holistic standard. How do we get our board involved? What do we do? So some of the things that I have talked about here, organisations are only just starting with. So I've started working with people a year, 18 months ago, and these are longer term initiatives. But as I said, if we're not asking the question in the first place, what problem are we trying to solve? We've got nothing to measure against. And that's where most organisations have been, not all. And there are some that have been successful. Stellantis is another one. My conference on the 29th of November, they're going to be speaking at the conference. They're going to talk about what they've measured and what results that has given them. And they've actually managed to measure manager behaviour as well, which I think is fundamental. So if anybody's interested, it's in London. It's on the 29th of November. You can drop me a message in the chat and I'll send you a link to register for that. But this is fundamentally what we're going to be looking at, is how do we create return on investment for our wellbeing strategies. And we're going to have some people talking who successfully done that.
Nice. That sounds like a very, very valuable event. So we'll send that out to people afterwards as well. And there's a bit of a follow-up question from Andy in the chat, and then I'll come to you, Mike, because I know you've got your hands up. So from the work you've done with clients, what does a great workplace wellbeing and mental health program look like? And I suppose that's following on from, the previous question. Obviously, you could go into a lot of depth on that. So maybe there are three key areas or something like that you could pick up on.
The other thing I can do, Christian, is I can send you my 10 steps to a wellbeing strategy download. And I only recently developed this because I felt at this point I've worked with enough clients to see what works and what we really need to do. And people need stepped sort of process, because it's not easy when there's not a very clear blueprint to follow. But fundamentally, it's around those three areas that I looked at. It's the first area really is to look at primary what causes stress in our workplace. So do a stress risk assessment, do a psychosocial risk assessment about what's causing stress. That you might use your HR engagement survey to get started with that. But you might need to do some employee forums as well. You might want to do a separate wellbeing survey, but do that. But fundamentally, look at your business drivers. What is it we're trying to solve inside of this, and what are we then going to measure as a result? That's your first stuff. And then you want to be looking at health promotion. So how to improve people's health and mental health in the organisation, how to educate them. You might do physical health fairs, you might do mental health programs inside of that. And then your third one is looking at your tertiary interventions. What happens when it all goes wrong and people need help? What do we have available for them? Occupational health, employee assistance programs, those sorts of things, GPs, online GPs, how we're helping people when it all goes wrong.
Perfect. We'll definitely send that 10 steps out. That would be very valuable for people as well. Mike, you've been very patiently waiting with your hand up, so do you want to
Hiya,
come in?
Mike.
Hiya, Heather. Thanks very much for that. And I think that 10 steps will probably answer the question that I had as well, listening to it. I think that sounds absolutely, because basically I've got buy-in from my top management, from my board, in terms of doing this. They've asked me, and I think quite correctly, to go back to the shop floor and find out, what they would like to see, what they want to get out of it. And that's the part where I'm a little bit stuck in terms of, how do I approach the shop floor? How do I go and find out what they would value in terms of an outreach like this, or a project like this?
It's a great question, and it doesn't come into your 10 steps. It's a different question, I think. So I think the first thing is, what are we asking our workforce? So if we're really going to consult with our workforce meaningfully, we don't just need to know about, well, I'd like some yoga, or I'd like some cycle to work schemes, or I'd like a bit more time for my lunch. What we really want to know is, what do they love about working here, and what do they hate about working here? What really stresses them out? What types of things are actually not helping them when it comes to work? Because quite often, like we say, we're all overwhelmed and overloaded, and actually it isn't necessarily the work, it's the stuff we have to get through in order to do the work. So it might be awful systems, it might be difficult relationships with other departments, it might be but it's trying to drill down into what actually makes them struggle with work. That's a better question to ask them. And then you can do that through a survey, you can do it through employee forums, getting them together to look at specific issues. And then the other thing you might want to do is, just like you have for safety, you might want to look at a kind of a wellbeing committee that sits a bit further down the organisation, that takes worker input. So you want a senior committee involved in this. You want your health and safety, your HR, your maybe your comms person, maybe a senior leader in a very stressful area of the business to be part of your senior committee. But you also probably want a committee that's a bit lower down the organisation, and they might also put in some ideas around things that actually people have asked for, that they would really value, that would really help when it comes to looking after their physical or mental health.
That helpful, Mike?
Thank you. That's brilliant, Heather. Appreciate that.
No worries.
Good stuff. Any more questions? Just go into reactions and raise your hand. We've got a question here from Arvin on LinkedIn, and this is more of a bigger macro picture question than a what do we practically do question, but I thought it was interesting. So are there cultural or societal factors that contribute to the mental health crisis, and how can we challenge and change these to help us to get to this position of thriving?
Oh, Arvind, yeah, it's so difficult, isn't it? Because
Arvind always has good questions.
Well done, Arvind. I love your question. We can get really, I personally find it quite demoralizing. I listen to the news and I think, what's the point in what I'm doing when we've got everything that's going on in the world that's causing uncertainty, stress. It can be a real struggle, can't it? But yes, fundamentally there are countries, as we know, that generally do better in this area, and that's the Nordic countries. And the Nordic countries, surprise, surprise, have a greater social safety net than we do. They pay a lot of higher taxes, but they also get looked after when they're sick. They also culturally have a different approach to work in a lot of cases. They are more likely to take some time off to go and look at their child's performance, or to go rowing in the afternoon or something like that, particularly in countries like Denmark. But they are also not immune to the mental health crisis. So what we've seen is their teenagers are also struggling in the same way as ours are because of technology. So I've created some workshops for ITV about dealing with overwhelm. And I actually had a group of my friends, my lucky friends that I piloted these courses on. I tell you what, they're lucky to know me. And one of them sat there and she just said to me, what is the point in all of this? When we look at the world and the way the world is set up, what's the point? And I said to her, but if we don't do this, if we don't look at this individually, if we don't enroll our communities in looking at this, if we don't enroll our organizations in looking at this, if we don't start a conversation around what a healthier life might look like, what healthier societies might look like, well, you know, it's always going to go this way, isn't it? We all we can do is start on ourselves, start on our community, start on our organization, start on our friends, raise the conversation, because I don't think it's even a conversation that's being had. You know, we've got the Tory party looking at, I think, are they looking at a minister for suicide or something like that? But we know that, well, people are going to take their own life if they're in a very bad situation. You know, we know the financial crisis is contributing to that. We know the fact you can't get a GP appointment is contributing to that. So are they going to look at the fundamentals behind that? Who knows? But really, for me, our governments should be judged on the well-being of their citizens. That's what they're there for. They're there to contribute to our well-being. It's not about GDP. It's not about, although GDP might support that, it's not about, you know, making sure their mates get wealthy. It's about making sure that all of us are happy and well as far as they can be. That should be the context. And we're miles away from that, miles away. I think the Nordic countries are slightly better than we are, but we're a long way away from it.
Yeah. You mentioned Alistair Campbell, and I'm assuming you had him involved in that event because he's quite public about struggling with his mental health and stuff. But him and Rory Stewart have a podcast called The Rest is Politics, which I am a big fan of. And they had a lady on 2 or 3 months ago called Kate Rayworth, I think her name was. And she talks about this concept of donut economics, which is all about the fact that we can't keep striving for growth because the planet has finite resources. Yeah. And as you just said, that we should be focusing more on well-being and happiness as an index of, you know, governmental success, rather than constant striving for growth, because it's impossible to keep growing just because of the way that the world works. And so, yeah, it's very, very interesting to think about if you could reframe that whole kind of political conversation, which I think would be pretty difficult to do, but it's certainly a conversation worth having.
Definitely, we've got to start somewhere.
Yeah. Matthew, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, just maybe share something with everybody. There's a Japanese concept called ikigai, which is the happiness in every day, and there's also the Norwegian version as well that is worth looking at. But the one with the Japanese one takes your Venn diagram with 4 quadrants, looking at different aspects of what gives you happiness. So every individual is different, but they talk about making money in your area of happiness and where you take flow from, which is an interesting concept to look into. I don't know whether there's other practitioners out there, but we kind of fall into health and safety as a second or tertiary role, but it somehow just feels natural, and it comes easier than the other aspects of our role. This is about finding your niche and then using your niche to make money, and then practicing your niche every day and doing it. Have a look into it. It's really, really interesting. But as a concept, ikigai.
I think I absolutely love it. And I created my business off the back of ikigai. I discovered it. I was in a bad place, and I read this book called Black Hole Focus, which I think might even be out of print. But during that, it asked you, what are you really good at that you don't use very often? What really provides you with meaning and purpose? What do you believe in? And then I answered this series of questions, and then I did some micro experiments in my role of things that I thought I was quite good at, but I wasn't really sure. And I tried a few things out, and I was like, right, this is what I'm built for. And I have this immense feeling of flow in what I do. It's not always, because obviously there's the stress of making your own money every month, as Christian and I were talking about earlier. So it's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but it does allow me to do something that I'm constantly learning in, that I get flow from, that I'm, you know, have meaning and purpose, and I make money from. So it's kind of, it's useful. But I love that. Love that you're looking at that, Matthew. Yeah,
I'm exactly the same. And that's both in my business, but also doing things like this, because you know this isn't paying the bills for my business and putting food on the table and paying off my mortgage, but it's something that I get a lot from, and hopefully everyone else gets a lot from as well. And so to me, that is a really valuable and worthwhile thing to do, and that does it's one of these activities that does leave me feeling uplifted and you know, contributes to my sort of positive mental well-being. So get involved and do some fun stuff that makes the world a better place, is all I can say to everybody. We're pretty much up on time. So thank you, everybody, for joining us. Before we do wrap up, though, Heather, I just want to give you the opportunity to do some plugs. So, where should people go to learn more? Or where can they buy the book? Where can they, contact you? Is LinkedIn a good way, for example, and so on and so forth?
Oh, thank you. So yeah, you can buy the book from Amazon, and it's I'm a Boss, Not a Shrink. You can definitely connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm HD Beach, that's BEACH, like the sand. Yeah, the conference is on the 29th of November. We've got 8 tickets left. If anybody would like to take one of those, just drop me a line. I'm heather@healthy-working.com. I'll pop it in there, the chat box now, so you've got that. And I mean, yes, so Matthew's pointed out the Deloitte report, and he's quite right. It's a 5-to-1 investment, 5-to-1 return in some areas. So not every area, but you get a greater return on investment if you do those primary interventions as opposed to the tertiary ones. So the primary ones are finding out what causes stress in the workplace. Yeah. That's all I'd like to do. I'd like to say, okay, you may have a little knowledge in this area, but you know that there are areas in health and safety in general that you're not an expert on. So you may not be an expert on confined spaces or DESIR or coma or something like that, and this may not be your area of expertise, but get some expertise in. So I can support with that, and I work with a lot of companies as like a critical friend. So they tell me what they've done, and I support them with moving that forward. I go and enroll their board in getting involved in this, and understanding what the drivers are. And obviously, my organisation does manage a training fundamentally. So yeah, very happy to talk to anybody further if they'd like to.
Thanks, Heather. I can see Steve's got his hand up, and he's been getting involved on LinkedIn. So I'm going to let Steve ask a question before we wrap up, if that's all right.
You look like you're in your car, Steve.
I am. I just caught the end of this, and I thought I've got to get on. It's such an important topic to me. Thanks for letting me tail on at the end for a question, because I founded a charity called Tough to Talk, and it's the UK's first charity that is focusing on the gap between there being plenty of great services to help men in their crisis, and the reasons why men aren't taking up those crises. And it often gets bandied around, well, it's all down to the stigma, isn't it? But no one is really tackling what that actual stigma is. And we've identified it's 2 key areas. One is that men don't recognize that they have a mental health problem often because of the 5 key factors that drive men towards suicide. Only one of them is a mental health problem. The other 4 are not mental health problems. So when they're having those overlapped and someone says, go and talk to someone, go speak to EAP, and they go, well, I haven't got a mental health problem, so why would I speak to them? That's one factor. But the one that's my question's about is the cognitive dissonance that men go through. If you ask a man what is the best way, if you ask most men, what is the best way for you to be able to find help for the crises that you're going through, they'll say, well, I'm probably better off talking to someone. But are they actually going to talk to someone? They're not, because the fear or the value of talking to someone is not as great as the gender bias, their stoic nature, their what they're led to believe, their perception of how they will be treated. So I guess my question is, how do you think we should bridge the gap between lots of great help that's out there, which we know there is, and how do we get the men to actually take it up?
Oh, Steve, I'd love to have a chat with you outside of this. I think it's a fascinating topic, and I personally believe that a lot of the interventions that we're offering are quite feminine in nature as well. They feel like they've been invented with females in mind. So I don't have an answer for you. I mean, I am working with some organisations, a lot of organisations that have a lot of men in them, and I alter my delivery. I basically flex according to the environment that I'm in. But is that successful? I don't know. So I'll be really interested in talking to you further about some of the research you've done in this area, and perhaps get you on a webinar of my own.
Yeah, no, I'd love to talk to you about that. We're currently in talks with partnering with the FA at the moment because they've recognised the problem, and we're working in very male-dominated spaces, and we are having some successes. but it has been very, very difficult. So because we know that 80% of men are not taking it up, we know that about 20% of women are not taking it up, because of the difference between masculine and feminine energies, and the difference between empathy and lacking in empathy. So every time we go into a business and say, listen, this subject's really important, you should go to it, all the men that turn up are the empathetic men. The men who really need it, they're not turning up. And that all links into this cognitive dissonance. And obviously those, what we're talking about with the 5 factors, only one of them being mental health. So they just disengage.
Yeah.
So yeah, you're right.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thanks for raising that right at the end.
Yeah, good timing. Yeah, feel free to connect with me. I'd love to.
I will, Steve. I will. Good
stuff. All right, guys. Well, some lovely comments in the chat, thanking us for the discussion. That, as I said a couple of minutes ago, is music to my ears, because that's kind of why I'm doing these sessions. So thank you all for joining. Thank you very much, Heather, for joining us and sharing your insights as well. And I look forward to keeping this conversation going on LinkedIn and elsewhere, and seeing you all at future versions of the Safety Roundtable. Have a great week, everybody.
Thanks so much for the invite. It's been fantastic, Christian. Thank you.
Pleasure. All right. Thanks a lot, guys. Cheers.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us on the Safety and Risk Success podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please hit follow and do share on social media. Does anyone you know spring to mind as a great guest, even yourself? If so, please contact us on podcast@slipsafety.co.uk. See you next week for another episode.